It's story time with the Histories, with your hosts, Matt Marine and Jen Dumas.
Presented by Anchor FM.
All right, so what I want to know really is how counterculture was the counterculture in the 1960s?
I feel like you're asking because you think I was actually there, and I was not.
No.
I was not there.
No, I know you were, but like it just seems to me like we did all this research, we went through all this stuff, we've been pulling things together for other courses, and
Mhm.
I just don't get the impression that there was this desire for change, like real revolutionary countercultural change. It seems to me that most of these like hippie, yippie type people, all they wanted to do was sit around, not go to war in Vietnam, listen to great music, and then, just kind of like go get a job at like IBM or something like that. And just kind of just like, I'm going to do what my parents did, but just like a slightly different route to getting to the same
I'm not
destination.
gonna lie, you're making sitting around, not going to war, listening to great music seem like a bad thing, and I can't think of anything that would actually be better.
No, yeah. But I'm just saying, I think this whole thing was kind of a scam. That's all. I'm
Okay,
not
fair,
saying that
fair.
look, what was accomplished in the 50s and 60s, there wasn't, it didn't lack lasting substance. That's, there's a lot of
Okay.
people who did a lot of stuff, but that was
Right.
an older generation. That was a lot of like the people who fought World War II and the silent generation.
Yeah.
This group of kids and stuff, like, I think they just kind of wanted to sit around and smoke grass.
Grass.
That's all.
Grass.
Well,
You sound like you're a
the
boomer.
vernacular. I've been reading a lot.
I
I've been
can
reading a lot.
All right, let's just get into this. Hey, everybody, this is your host, Jen Dumas, along with fellow host Matt Breen, and you're listening to Storytime with the Historists, the podcast focused on world history stories that are sometimes bizarre, often entertaining, and always factual. Today, we're going to channel our inner boomer, kind of, we're going to dust off those old Bob Dylan records and tell the story of how great things used to be by telling you the story of America's Days of Rage. Before we get started, though, let's talk about our main sources. What you got for us,
Yeah,
Matt?
this is huge. This is we teased it at the end of our last episode. This is a 3-part overarching series that we'll get into the connections to here. But for this particular episode, what we're looking at is a vast array of essays and articles and one primary book, Days of Rage, America's Radical Underground, the FBI, and the Forgotten Age of Revolutionary Violence by Brian Burrow, which we drew on extensively for this. But like I said, there was just a whole bunch of stuff. I think what's probably best is we'll do what we've done in the past when we've had these types of episodes and post just a complete bibliography. And we're excited for all of this because this was pretty extensive and required a lot of back reading and corroboration and really forced us to brush off those historian skills.
I know, it's
like
been a
being
while.
back in college.
Grad
Yeah,
school,
which was
yeah.
fun. Yeah, it was
So-
fun.
So why this topic? Why?
All right. So recently, over the course of the last 5 years, and then very pointedly here in 2025, there has been a rise in political violence and the ongoing discussions of fascism and authoritarianism and totalitarianism in Western societies around the world really felt like a good inlet to this conversation and discussion. However, being a historically based podcast, we kind of looked back into the 20th century and found that there was a lot of discussion of revolutionary violence, and not just in the 1930s and 40s. And that's where a lot of people who've made requests of us to discuss fascism and particularly how it pertains to, the last 10, 15 years in Western society. But there was some other stuff that we started coming across that just made this discussion of political violence seem much more relevant. So, simply put, the period between 2015 and 2025, and really likely beyond, has not been the only period where resurgent political violence linked to a hard left-right divide has occurred, not in the U.S. and not globally either. So we figured before we touched on the here and now, there were some stories that needed to be told, stories that have been memory hold, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I have to be honest. Every time I feel really crappy about this country and think, my God, this is the worst it's ever been, just go back in history. It just gives you an idea that it's been bad before and we can recover. to some degree. So, as depressing as this topic was, it was also a little soul uplifting, and that maybe we can return to normal one day.
Yeah, totally. And it felt really prescient for us to hop into the 1960s in the United States.
Hmm.
Because if you just go down the list, there were racial acts of violence directed at civil rights movement leaders, including assassinations, lynchings, bombings, murders, and beatings administered by private citizens and police all across the country. There were police riots in 1968 at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, and there was a race riot at the Miami Republican National Convention that same year. In 1969, there's the Manson murders, which are the shootings that take place at the LaBianca and Tate houses. There's the shooting of Gary Hinman and lots of Papa shooting. All of those were part of these like broad like Manson acts of violence. There was the violence from and towards the Black Panther Party and directed towards the Black Liberation Army, and then the Black Liberation Army responding. There's violence from and towards the anti-Vietnam War movement all through the end of the 1960s. There's the Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapping of Patty Hearst and
Yep.
the subsequent violence that took place in the mid-70s there. I mean, just to kind of put a fine point on it, during an 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, the FBI counted more than 1,800 bombings of various kinds. That's almost 5 a day. And the group we will be examining here in this series, the Weather Underground, claimed to have participated in 1,800 acts of political violence in a 6-year period, including 25 high-profile bombings.
So basically, the 1960s were, I don't even know. I mean, that's a lot of violence,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
and some
And
of
I
this,
get it because so much was going on, and there was challenge to societal norms and the societal traditional structure, and of course, that's going to lead to it. Uh, but yeah, that's a lot.
yeah, I mean, and not only is volumetrically this violence occurring at such a high rate and the destructive capacity of this violence, but some of the acts themselves, like here, just when doing some of the initial research for this series, I
Hmm.
came across this New York Times article about the August 11th guerrilla movement that managed to shoot down a police helicopter in Oakland in 1973 by sniping the two officers flying the machine.
Okay, first of all, how do you snipe people? How could you? The helicopter's moving. Isn't that like a? I don't even know how that could be possible.
I have no idea. I mean, some of the source work said they had like a machine gun, but then they said sniped. That makes it sound like a single shot. Can you imagine in
No,
2025 if some group of people, I don't know what political affiliation, where they are on the spectrum, it does not matter,
no.
shot down a police helicopter and killed the pilots?
I don't. Yeah,
And
no.
this is just one of another 1,800 some acts of violence that year.
You know,
It's insane.
it is crazy, and I just bringing this in. I just saw the movie. Do you ever see the movie Civil War with Kirsten Dunst?
No, I did not.
Okay, so that movie that was rough to watch, and I don't know, how 100%. It wasn't like 100% accurate. It's definitely fictionalized, but the idea of how easy that violence can happen when a society turns on itself, and it was just this just makes me think about that. It's like, could the country head this way? I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, totally. And then start to factor in who's committing the violence. And
Yeah.
that's going to be a huge element of this, like, kind of loosely connected 3-part miniseries that we've got set up here,
Mhm.
which again starts in the United States, and then we're going to hop over to Italy, and then we're going to end in Chile. And in each episode, we'll look at how violence from the left or violence attributed to the left paved the way for reactionary violence from the right. And this reactionary violence oftentimes corresponded with authoritarian policies, or in a real and documented manner, the rise of a fascist movement. And I think all of that to say that, like, when you have this level of violence, when it's
Mhm.
occurring and people want to make sense of the violence and attribute political party or
Mhm.
movement or end of the political spectrum for the responsibility, what can come of this is something that is even more violent and more destructive for the society after the fact. And so, when we look at these events specifically in the late 1960s and 1970s in the United States and beyond,
Mhm.
each one of our chosen topics here really and truly fits into this framework of violence that's occurring because of what's happening more broadly within the
Uh-huh.
given society, but then the violence and reaction towards that violence and how that continues to degenerate the socio-political conditions of the given state.
Well, yeah, because violence begets violence begets violence. We know this. I mean, this is historically inaccuracy, and so I don't think it's an unfounded concern.
Yeah, totally, right?
Yeah.
And so before we launch into our story here today, I think something that many of our listeners might be familiar with is in terms of like an overarching model for this type of violent action being attributed to a group and then a reaction to that violence, like, paving the way for some sort of alteration to society might be glimpsed if we look at the Reichstag fire 1930s Germany. And in this event, there are allegations that the Nazi Party actually perpetrates the burning of the Reichstag, which is the German version of their Congress, their deliberative parliamentary body, and that this triggered the utilization of an element of the Constitution to gain emergency powers, which then thrust Adolf Hitler into his dictatorship
Uh-huh.
and thus the ascension of the Nazis and the Third Reich. This type of violence, where a act might be attributed to a group and then used to pave the way for some sort of authoritarian
Uh-huh.
policy, was termed in the 70s and 1980s coming out of Italy as something known as the strategy of tension. And for listeners, the strategy of tension is something we're going to talk a lot about in this series. So a good definition would be helpful here. The strategy of tension is a political policy where violent struggle is encouraged rather than suppressed. The purpose is to create a general feeling of insecurity within the population and make people seek security in a strong government. And this
So,
is oh, go
but
ahead.
for a political gain is really what it is.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And we'll take the deepest dive look at that in Italy during the years of lead. But before we can get there, let's hop over to the United States at the beginning of the 1960s and begin to tell our story proper with the anti-war movement and introduce ourselves to our group of violent revolutionaries that we're going to examine today. So, Jen, as you always do,
I love
hit
my
them with some
context.
historical context.
All right, so we're going to start with the Port Huron Statement. So in June of 1962, some delegates of the newly formed Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, gathered in Port Huron, Michigan, and they were basically drafting a manifesto of what we call New Left ideas, right? Many were college students, very influenced by they were affluent, because their families were affluent, but it's also the time of the emerging civil rights movement. There's a lot of Cold War tensions going on. And so SDS kind of evolved from a socialist leaning league for like industrial democracy into more of a radical participatory democracy in place of like the old liberal orthodoxy system, right? And so participatory democracy really is this idea. I think of it more like like true civic participation, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah.
it's not just a certain age group are involved or a certain demographic, but it is truly the idea that the youth, young adults and stuff like that, like their role is to participate in this democracy, not just sit back, stand by and wait for the older generations to make these democratic decisions.
Yeah,
Would you
that makes
agree?
sense. Yeah, totally. Because this is the era of the baby boomers. The me generation is what they were called before they were the baby boomers,
Mhm.
starting to come into their own, right? Their parents had fought World War II. The United States is experiencing this period of unprecedented wealth and financial and economic security for most citizens, mainly white citizens. But it's hard to argue that not all ships were being lifted by this rising tide of economic prosperity.
Mhm.
However, a lot of these young people who were participating in the civil rights movement, like you said, they had seen the conditions of the South through like the freedom rides and the voter registration movements. And many of them, including the soon-to-be leader of the SDS, felt like there needed to be some sort of change. And what they wanted to do was kind of take the union organizing model of the turn of the 20th century
Mhm.
and use that to create a new political movement. They didn't want to just be part of the liberal Democrat or liberal Republican, which sounds weird saying that in
I know, right?
2025,
I know,
right? That just
right?
seems like a misnomer. But like this liberal idealism really and truly was the common political and sort of social thought process for almost all Americans, regardless of which party they voted on. But anyway, these guys wanted to do something different. They wanted to do something new, and they wanted it to be, like you said, youth oriented.
Right. Because I think, like, when we look at it, we know they were completely dissatisfied with society, right? Especially the racial segregation and violence that was taking place. But at the same time, they're also quite happy with their socioeconomic status. So it's
Oh yeah.
like, that's a little bit, you're like, yeah, I really want to, fight all this injustice and stuff, but I really like where I am socioeconomically, right? Is
Yeah,
that,
totally.
yeah,
Yeah. No, they are very comfortable, and they don't want to get rid of their creature comforts. They just want things to be a little bit better for all people, I guess, would be the easiest way of breaking down what the SDS was about. Yeah, and they write this whole thing out, right?
yeah, this is they're seeking they want civil disobedience, but not violence, which is very common during this period, right? They want a more
Mhm.
populist style form of democracy, which makes sense because they want more people to have a voice. Plus, they're also going to encourage reforms in education, like the labor working class realm and their role in democracy. And that's what they're really looking for and I think that points to what you're saying, is they just want to make life a little bit better for everybody. And what this and at first it doesn't sound very, radical or anything like that, but really what this was a direct challenge to the traditional Southern Democrats and the New Deal consensus that really was defining the left at the time period.
Yeah.
And that is a big challenge.
Yeah, and not just the Southern Democrats, but this rising conservative movement that's taking over the
Yeah.
Republican Party as well. And yeah, no, I think that this idea that they could be the leaders and they could challenge, they were seeking to challenge from a place that, one, they all were at, college campuses and universities, and two, they felt like, if we could just make things a little bit better for all people, if we can just get rid of some of this fear with Cold War violence and destruction and racial tension at home, that we'll be a little bit better off. Like from the Port Huron statement that you referenced earlier, quote, "We are people of this generation bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit," end quote.
Can I have a piece of their modest comfort? I would like a piece of
Yeah.
that modest comfort in 2025.
Can
Thank
you
you.
imagine,
No.
getting a house for like a mortgage for like $4,000?
No, I can't. I think my parents paid $27,000 for their first house.
Yeah, I know. Like their entire college tuition and everything else was like $700.
I know. I can't. It makes me depressed. But anyway,
Yeah.
okay. So, and that makes sense, right? The universities traditionally are incubators of change, right?
Mhm.
This is, and especially we see that more even past the 1960s. And from the same statement that you just read of, they quote, what they say is the role of the student involves the attainment of skills and habits of mind and action necessary for responsible participation in the affairs of government and society on all levels, campus, community, state, national, and international. And isn't that what we're trying to do in high schools too? I think this has always been our goal as teachers. This is what you want.
Yeah, totally, right? You want to utilize your education and your experiences in the world to create some sort of transformation. I think what's naive about this is that these systems that the SDS were running up against, and what the Port Huron statement was meant to call people to action towards, were entrenched
Oh, yeah.
and weren't going to give up power in any way. And I think this is where earlier when I was like, how revolutionary was this movement? How counterculture was this movement? I think it plays out. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there should be violence, but at the beginning, the Port Huron statement explicitly discourages political violence. Quote, "In social change, we find violence to be abhorrent because it requires the transformation of people into a depersonalized object of hate. It is imperative that the means of violence be abolished," end quote. This critique of militarism, the Cold War consensus that you referenced earlier between the parties to freeze internal instability so as to fight the USSR, this idea that we were going to see a student-led backlash against the military-industrial complex and both political parties who were okay with the status quo. Like I said, everybody was this kind of liberal, kind of blasé sort of pacifism, for lack of a better term. These guys were saying like, hey, look, we can do teach-ins and sit-ins and protests to get through all of this. We shouldn't be using any violence whatsoever. So, because if we utilize some sort of violence, then there will be violence coming back at us, and this will just bolster the strength of the system overall.
So are you saying there is naivete because they thought that they could go against all these like mega organizations and actually affect change with simple things like sit-ins? But I got to be honest with you. I totally get what you're saying and I agree with that, but I love this line. The idea that violence turns us into depersonalized objects of hate. Because isn't that
100%.
what we're seeing today?
I mean, it's that same sort of thing of like, what do you expect to have happen in the Russian Revolution, for example,
Mhm.
when there's this violent, chaotic overthrow of the Tsarist system and the destruction of the Eastern Orthodox Russian Church
Mhm.
and the just complete and utter destruction of the nobility and the boyar class within Russia. Like, when you kill that many people, what
Mhm.
you're left with is a violent society. And of course, in Russia, we see the civil war and this constant reversion back towards violence to solve problems during the Stalinist era and Khrushchev and beyond. And you see this across the world with revolutionary movements. And so I don't disagree with you. I think that like to aspire to be nonviolent, to bake into your bread this idea that you're not going to have a violent overthrow of anything is what you would hope in a
Right.
liberal society. And again, that's why I'm like, how revolutionary are
Yeah.
all of these SCS guys?
Yeah.
Because that is the liberal framework, is you will protest and vote your way out of your problems. I just think it's naive to think that there was going to be no violence perpetrated from the SDS direction, uh, and that they could achieve their goals without some manner of violence. And all through the history of this time period, we
Mhm.
see that, yes, there are nonviolent movements, to be sure, the civil rights movement in particular, right, led by King et al. But also there were also, violent revolutionary groups pushing for civil rights as well, especially as we get deeper into the 1960s.
Yeah,
And
totally
so
true.
I just think that like this idea that you're going to create some sort of change at the level that they believe they were, sans violence, was naive, especially for this time period.
Yeah.
Especially, and we discussed that kind of at length, right, in the Lumumba episode.
Yeah. I think I was looking at the depersonalized of hate more from a standpoint is, and again, we can't get too much into this, but if we look at society today, the Western society today, and how with social media and everything else, how many of us, okay, through all of this have been depersonalized. And as a result of that depersonalized, how much hate do we generate because we've depersonalized people? It's ridiculous.
100%. 100%. Yeah, I think we just got to hop into the birth of the
Yeah,
Weathermen
let's
and the
go.
Weather Underground, because that's exactly what happens, right? What you just said is unfortunately what happened. So this aforementioned rise in violence through the mid and especially the late 1960s started to create resentments within the SDS and challenge the political wisdom of the Port Huron Statement. During the group's 1969 convention, things really did come to a head.
Okay.
Decentralized cultural critique and civil disobedience did not seem to be enough to either force broad sociocultural change or to challenge the ever-growing presence of the U.S. military in Vietnam. The days of, quote, expanded political discourse, end quote, labor reforms and coalition groups seen as to traditional liberal sort of movements were about to end. And this happens to coincide with the rise of more radical groups, especially racially derived groups such as the Black Panther Party coming out of Oakland in particular, that saw the
Mhm.
racial status quo as no longer acceptable, that saw capitalism's role in the subjugation of Black Americans as no longer acceptable, and wanted to take action. And this action was actually being taken seriously by
Mhm.
the system. And the SCS noticed that.
Yeah, and you know what's funny is that I don't wanna make too many connections to modern day because we're certainly not advocating violence or
Yeah,
revolution, right?
yeah, I think we're
But
kind of doing this though, because we're
but
noticing them left, right, and
I'm like,
center.
"Oh my god, look at all this." Like, seriously, aren't we at a place, and I'm gonna solely talk about the United States because I don't know what's going, I mean, I know what's going on in Western Europe, but I don't wanna talk for them, but we can't have discourse anymore. We don't have coalition groups anymore. We can't talk to each other on either side of the political aisle about anything.
No. And then increasingly, even within our own groups
Yeah.
that exist now, we're having difficulty. the conversations within the leftist center caucuses and the right of center caucuses and political movements also are spinning out of control. And this is exactly what happened with
This is
SDS
frightening.
in
Yes.
1969. So the SDS calls their convention,
Mm-hmm.
and all the members are called together to vote on bylaws and the next steps, the next year's platform, etc. And these internal tensions between some more militant groups, in particular a group called the Revolutionary Youth Movement and a more radical Marxist group, the Revolutionary Youth Movement too. I don't know why they couldn't come
Why?
up with
Come
a
up with your own
different
name. Come on.
It's just a separate name. Like,
Make
how
an
about
effort.
the Revolutionary Bread Breakers? Like,
Yeah,
look, I just did
anything.
it.
I know.
Anything. It's just the Revolutionary Youth Movement too.
I feel like that's
Anyway.
lazy.
Yeah, totally. And then there were these other orthodox Marxists and Maoists, known as the Workers' Student Alliance and the Progressive Labor Group. They led to the creation of a set of factions within the convention.
Ooh.
And it's within this convention that the SDS official publication released and circulated a magazine. This magazine was titled, quote, "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows." And this was published in 1969. And that's referencing Bob Dylan, right? That's a Bob Dylan song. Yep. Subterranean Homesick Blues is the name of the song. And in this magazine, You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows, there was a call for the first time for violent revolution and solidarity with global anti-imperialist struggle and American Black liberation movements like the Black Panther Party. This magazine article rejected electoral politics. It called for the, quote, "destruction of U.S. imperialism," end quote, and emphasized armed struggle as necessary. And this is all in the wake of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and RFK, along with the campus shootings at Kent State and Jackson State in 1969. 1968, 69. These were exceptionally violent years in American history.
Yeah, so it's violence begetting violence. This is exactly what we talked about. Yeah.
These factions, the various youth movements 1 and 2, and then the Marxists and the labor factions, etc. All of them are looking at what's taking place inside of the United States and basically saying, we got to wise up and wake up. We got to arm ourselves, and we need to take an actual stand.
That's wow.
Yeah. And who knows to say, like, if this had just stayed as a magazine article, what would have happened at the SDS convention? But one of the leaders of the militant revolutionary youth movement, a man named Mark Rudd, who's best known as the leader of the Columbia University student uprising in 1968, the one that was pretty widely popularized in 2023 with the campus uprisings at Columbia. Him and a woman named Bernadine Dorn broke away from the groups that were kind of in charge of the SDS, and they started to model their platform on violent leftist liberation groups such as those found in Central and South America, Africa, and Asia. And they called themselves
That's certainly violent.
The Weathermen. One quick side note on all of this, and this is not my observation, but when I was doing the readings and pulling stuff together for all of this, political theorist, author, and podcaster Matt Christman pointed out in one of his podcast episodes about just history, in an episode that he did about the Weather Underground, he said it's stupid for a Leninist revolutionary vanguard to name itself. Especially to call themselves like a leadership
weatherman,
group. Yeah, because he says, like, quote, "If you don't need a weatherman to see which way the wind is blowing, it means it is self-evident which way the wind is blowing. And so there's no need for someone to tell you what to do. And therefore you don't need a leadership group."
That's fair. That's totally fair. Like, why would you're like, you don't need a weatherman, but we're going to call ourselves weatherman.
But we're the weatherman and we're going to put ourselves in charge.
People, read the room.
It just all kind of smacks at this idea. Like, again, like, there are people in the American South putting their lives on the line, African American predominantly, but white citizens as well, who are putting their lives on the line in nonviolent movements, finding themselves subjected to kidnappings and assaults and bombings and murders and lynchings, like we said before. And these guys are out here at their posh retreats talking about like Bob Dylan songs and how, like, if you just give them a little bit of time, they're going to be the next Che Guevaras of the world. And it's like
a little ridiculous
to take some of this seriously. Yeah. And obviously it does become very serious.
Yeah, it does.
However, it's I don't know if they ever really wanted the smoke, as the kids would say these days.
They talked the talk but didn't walk the walk, but then had to walk the walk because they talked the talk? Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. So anyway, this group, breakaway weathermen, planned their first event. I know it's so stupid.
I'm sorry.
They planned their first event in 1969. They call it the Days of Rage.
Well, at least that's a better title than
The
Weatherman.
Days of Rage is catchy. Somebody actually did some homework on that one. They probably got some sort of like liberal arts, English student,
Too.
English
Yeah.
major or something there who's like, I can pen something here for you. I'll be Shakespeare's bard. All right. So this event is launched by the Weathermen, and it took public control of the SES, and they wanted to create a violent uprising of working class youth, specifically in the city of Chicago. Right.
Wait,
And this is
Can I ask a quick question? Didn't we just say these were like very comfortable, affluent, let's really be honest, mostly white kids, right? And now they're saying, but wait a minute, we want the violent uprising to be the working class youth.
Well, because they perceive the working class to be much more willing to be violent, which is not true.
No,
There's
and if
no
you want
evidence that would suggest that
if
whatsoever.
you want this violent movement, shouldn't you be the ones?
Jen, they're smoking grass
I
and
know, I
listening to
know.
Bob,
See, I know, I
right?
gotcha. I know.
Hey, just sit down in the park and hang out. Come
Have
on.
someone else do the work for you.
Yeah,
Oh my God.
exactly. They're the professional managerial class. They're gonna be at IBM
I know,
soon.
that's right. You're right. Now it makes all sense. Yeah,
Yeah, see what I'm saying? Right.
I
So
do.
anyway, they think if they can get out there, they can inspire the masses, and these masses will go out there and like commit random acts of violence, right? And this plan truly was meant to be random, right? This random act of violence, Days of Rage plan was rejected wholly by the SDS as a whole. Like to be redundant there. They voted down. There is no official sanctioning of the Days of Rage. And in fact, like the one group that the Weathermen were hoping to impress the most, the Black Panther Party, because hey guys, look, we're down for the cause and we do violence too. The Black Panther Party saw this potential act of violence as only hurting radical resistance and propping up the law and order wing of society. That this is something that could be pointed to and used to create a more authoritarian backlash. So think back to that strategy of
Yeah.
tension idea.
Yep.
When you have violence that seems out of control, that the hope is that the broader public will react to that violence by empowering its government to become more authoritarian.
Well, yeah, because it's not organized. It's random. It's not this big unified movement that tends to affect change best in this country. It just seems like a little violence here and a little violence here and a little violence here and a little violence here. And if people don't understand the connection between it, then it becomes almost useless.
Yeah, and that's kind of what happens too when the Days of Rage kick off.
Mhm.
So there was this belief that there was going to be, 800 people who would show up to kick things off, maybe 1,000 that would show up and kick things off with the universal like call to action, which was going to be the bombing of a police statue at the Haymarket Square Memorial, which like we should probably do a podcast on that.
We
But
probably
anyway,
should, yeah.
yeah, probably should. Anyway, this small group was supposed to rampage through the city of Chicago. They were going to break windows. They were going to throw poop at people's houses, especially in like Hyde Park and the
Yeah.
University of Chicago and like all the rich neighborhoods, right? Destroy property. In actuality, maybe only 300 people participated because a massive Chicago police presence was out and about within the city.
Uh-huh.
And the Days of Rage were really just kind of like the days of like yelling at your mom and dad that like they can't come in your room. Like this was not the massive event that they Weathermen had hoped it would be.
Well, yeah, I mean, I get it.
They
They
were
didn't.
just throwing poop at people's houses.
Yeah, I mean,
That's
it
what
just
kids
was.
our age used to do, right? Remember when they would, some kids, not us, we're
Yeah, I
good
didn't.
kids, but they would go and they'd light the poop bags on fire and leave them and then
Oh yeah,
doorbell ditch it.
I never participated, but I did hear about it.
No,
Yeah.
but it forever memorialized in Billy Madison, right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
you know what I'm talking about. Yeah,
I do know what
they
you're
did
talking
that. This is the first known
This is the first Billy Madison.
poop action in American history.
So
And
this is an
it's-
epic level failure. We can
Yeah.
see that, right? This
Yeah. And it should have led to nothing. However,
Right.
enter the nefarious face of violence that was like I talked about before. There are actually real people out there risking it. The weathermen, even though this event flopped, are further radicalized shortly after the Days of Rage when Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton is assassinated by the Chicago PD, who were allegedly acting on the orders of the FBI. He's shot in his bed while he's asleep. His pregnant wife is laying next to him.
God.
There's Judas and the Black Messiah, a great movie
Mhm.
that came out. There's a series of documentaries out as well about Fred Hampton and his life and death. We know this to be true, the Chicago PD assassination and the FBI involvement, because there was a civil trial and an award to Fred Hampton's wife or girlfriend
Yeah.
and child some years later as a result of his murder at the hands of the Chicago PD. And the Weather Underground saw this assassination as another indication that they needed to take on a more radical stance. So the group decided that violent resistance needed to be the only real action moving forward, and there needed to be a complete and total abandonment of the nonviolent principles that had galvanized and animated the SDS from 1962 to 1969.
Okay.
So the Black Panther Party and the Weather Underground, they believed that since the FBI had killed Fred Hampton, that they were legitimate targets, and both groups declare war on the FBI, who then in turn declares war back, not like declarations, but through
Right.
action on radical groups in particular and on white people who had involved themselves in this movement. And so with this sort of informal declaration of war being made by both sides, the Weather Underground brings together what they call their War Council, which again just
War
stinks of
Council.
people.
Oh my God.
I know. Just play it. Like this is somebody who
Oh.
just read about like Crazy Horse or something, right? And they're like, we
Or
need
played
a war.
Risk or
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
I'm
Some sort
sorry.
of
I'm sorry.
tabletop RPG.
I know, right?
Well, if we roll 7, we win. Like this is something ridiculous. And they give it a stupid name too. They meet in Flint, Michigan. They dub this meeting Wargasm.
Are you
Now,
kidding me?
you can just sit in that for a second. Yeah, Wargasm. And they called it this because it was an anti-war meeting and a parallel series of orgies because they needed to maintain stronger relationships between the bourgeois group members. And so no more boyfriends and girlfriends and husbands and wives. Everybody's everybody else's property. Yeah,
Like legit orgies is what you're saying.
legit orgies. This is their war plan. Convince me I'm wrong that this is just a bunch of kids play acting at being revolutionaries right now.
Nope, I know hallucinogenics were available at this time, and that is the only way to explain. You know what I want to do is we want to deal with the social injustices of the world in a more violent fashion and have orgies at the same time. There is no way that is not drug induced.
Yeah, Fred Hampton just got shot in his bed, and this is how we're going to respond to it. This also is like these guys all not wanting to look too critically at like Mao in particular and what was going on in China, and feeling that like the disentanglement of their bourgeois lifestyle needed to be a core element of their violent resistance.
Mhm.
And so if you get rid of your attachments, whether they
Right.
be relational or economic or cultural or whatever they might be, and you open yourself up to these more quote unquote authentic experiences, then you're going to be a better revolutionary fighter, which I don't think that's true.
I don't think that's in any of the handbooks.
I don't remember reading any Sun Tzu where it said orgies before combat
Right.
make you a better warrior. No.
Yeah, no.
Shockingly, these orgies alienated what was left of the SDS.
Can't
And
imagine why.
the whole thing implodes. So this is a decades-long group helmed by Tom Hayden and was out there in the forefront of the student resistance movement. And was on various TV programs and publications and being taken seriously. Hayden was one of the Chicago 7 who was put on trial for the police riot at the Democratic National Convention that we talked about earlier. These were people with high profile, and within a 1-month period, the entire thing comes crumbling down because a bunch of people who couldn't even come up with like their own original names for their own caucuses or names that made sense. You don't need a weatherman to see which way. Of course, it's so stupid. And then they have their poop slinging and
It's so
their
stupid.
wargasm event, and they're now destroyed this entire movement. Which, like, again, like, I don't think that we should look at the SDS and hold it up as this like paragon of like excellence. However, I do think you and I both recognize that like the values and goals of the SDS were like meaningful,
They were.
and what the weathermen are trying to do is not meaningful, and even in the eyes of their own peers will be destructive.
I guess sex doesn't sell.
No. Oh, yeah, you should go book yourself a gig up at Central City Black
Right?
Hawk.
There you go.
So the Days of Rage permanently fracture the SES and the Weathermen, which are now roughly 100 people at most,
Yeah, I don't believe
decide
anything they say. Yeah.
no, they decide they're going to soldier on. This group is going to fall under the leadership of two people, one of whom was a champion at the SDS convention. That was
Mhm.
Bernadine Dorn.
Mhm.
And the other person is her partner, lover, baby daddy, eventually, a man by the
Fantastic.
name of Bill Ayers. And it's with the radicalization and bombing campaigns of the Weathermen Underground that we'll pick back up for part 2 of this episode on the Days of Rage and the bombing campaigns of the Weather Underground.
Unbelievable. And you see, people, this is why history is so entertaining. We couldn't make this up if we tried.
And this is
This is
the more fully baked portion of this story.
nice.
From here on out, like, we don't have bread. We don't even have dough. It's like some gruel that you forgot to put in the oven is what we're going to be fed by the Weathermen Underground in the future. And then, this will all pale to what we see in Europe and South America.
Totally.
Yeah. Right.
Well, let's not give them too many spoiler alerts.
No, we can't.
Yeah.
But you got to tune back in for part 2 because it's going to be well worth it.
So once again, listeners, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you will continue on with the other 2 parts of this series. Matt, thank you so much. It's thoroughly delightful once again to podcast with you.
Oh, yeah, so much fun. We've been sitting on this one for over a year. So it feels good to finally start getting this out of our brains before it melts us.
I know, right? And now I can't get the Weathermen and orgies out of my head, so that's fun. All right, you guys. Well, until next time, you can follow us on Spotify, follow us on iTunes, or I think anywhere podcasts are available.
Anywhere where podcasts are found. Huge thank you to the Addington Music Collective for their help in our intro-outro music. And until next time, listeners, bye.
See you later.